Please, just let me explain. Yes, I understand. She was right here. Check the security cameras now. It will show you where I was. I'm telling the truth.
The gate agent's voice cracked over the intercom, calling for final boarding on Flight 2207 to Newark. And that's when two security officers grabbed a man by his suit jacket and started dragging him backward through the jet bridge. His loafers scraping the floor, his boarding pass fluttering out of his hand like a dying bird. Nobody in that terminal knew his name. Nobody knew that in 11 minutes, this same man was about to make one phone call that would cost the airline $5 billion. Nobody knew that the reason he was even taking this flight, the reason he'd been sitting in seat 2A with his eyes closed and his jaw locked tight, was because 6 hours earlier, he'd buried his mother. This is his story. Marcus Bell was 41 years old, and if you saw him in a boardroom, you'd think the man had never lost a night's sleep in his life. Tailored charcoal suits, a watch that cost more than most people's cars, a voice so calm it made grown executives sweat. He was the founder and CEO of Halcyon Capital, a private equity firm that quietly controlled stakes in half a dozen industries: logistics, healthcare, and yes, aviation. But Marcus didn't build that company on luck. He built it on nights he doesn't talk about. Nights when he was 23 years old, sleeping in his car outside a Waffle House in Charlotte because he couldn't afford the deposit on an apartment, eating cold fries for dinner, and reading finance textbooks by the dome light because the library had already closed. His father left when Marcus was 6, didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, just an empty side of the closet and a mother who cried in the bathroom with the fan on so her son wouldn't hear it through the walls. But Marcus heard it anyway. He heard it every single night for 2 years, and something in him decided, right there in that trailer in Gastonia, North Carolina, that he would never let a woman he loved cry like that again. Not her. Not anyone. His mother, Ruth Bell, raised him alone on a nursing assistant's salary, working double shifts at a hospital that didn't even give her health insurance until her 3rd year. She came home smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion, and she'd still find the energy to sit at the kitchen table and check his homework, tracing her finger under every math problem like she was the one being tested. "You gonna be somebody, Marcus," she used to tell him. "Not because we got money, because we got will." He used to roll his eyes at that when he was 14. He'd give anything to hear her say it one more time now. She passed away on a Tuesday morning, in a hospital bed in a wing of a hospital system and this detail matters, so hold on to it. Halcyon Capital had quietly invested in 2 years earlier. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. They caught it late because, for 8 months, Ruth Bell kept telling her son she was just tired, kept insisting she didn't want to be a burden, kept refusing to go to the doctor, because 40 years of being poor and black in America teaches you that hospitals are places where you get talked down to, misdiagnosed, or bankrupted, sometimes all three. By the time Marcus physically drove her to get scanned, forced her into the car himself while she protested the whole way, the cancer had already spread to her liver and her lungs. He canceled board meetings. He canceled a 9-figure acquisition call. He sat in that hospital room for 11 weeks, sleeping in a reclining chair that never quite reclined enough, holding his mother's hand while machines beeped out a rhythm that was slowing down every single day. He held her hand when she stopped remembering what year it was. He held her hand when she started calling him by his father's name in her sleep, and he didn't correct her, because what did it matter now? And he held her hand at 4:47 in the morning, when the beeping finally, mercifully, stopped. He did not cry in that room. Marcus Bell had spent 18 years training himself not to cry in front of anyone, because the first time he cried in front of his stepfather, a mean, bitter man his mother married when Marcus was 9, hoping for stability and getting something closer to a cage, the man told him, "Crying is for boys who ain't learned to be men yet," and backhanded him across a kitchen that smelled like burnt grease. Marcus was 9 years old. He learned that lesson the way you learn a scar, permanently, and without ever asking to. So when his mother died, Marcus didn't cry. He signed the paperwork. He selected the casket, walnut with brushed silver handles, because she always said walnut. Furniture looked like money, and he wanted her to have that finally at the very end. He gave the eulogy without his voice breaking once, though everyone in that church could see his hands shaking on the podium. He shook hands with a receiving line of relatives and old church members for 2 hours. And then, 6 hours after they lowered his mother into the ground in Gastonia, North Carolina, Marcus Bell got into a car, went straight to the airport, and boarded a flight to Newark, because in the morning he had a board meeting that could not wait. Not because Halcyon needed him there, because if he sat still, even for 1 more hour, he was afraid of what would come out of him. That's the man security dragged off that plane. Here's what happened. Marcus boarded early, in first class, seat 2A, wearing a dark suit because he hadn't had time to change out of his funeral clothes. He was quiet. He kept his sunglasses on even though the cabin lights were dim. A flight attendant named Denise, sweet woman, been doing this job 11 years, noticed he hadn't touched the welcome drink, noticed his jaw kept clenching like he was holding something in with his teeth, and she simply asked, gently, "Sir, are you doing all right? Can I get you anything?" That's all it was, a kind question. But 3 rows back, a passenger named Gregory Finch, mid-50s, white, agitated, already 2 bourbons deep before boarding even finished, leaned into the aisle and said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "Why's he up here? This is a full flight. They don't usually let just anybody sit in first class." Denise tried to defuse it. Marcus said nothing at all, didn't even turn his head, just sat there with his eyes closed behind those. Sunglasses, doing everything in his power to hold together 6 hours after burying his mother. But Finch kept going, louder now, saying he felt uncomfortable, saying, maybe somebody should check that his ticket was even real. And here's the part that still makes Marcus's hands shake when he tells it. A junior gate supervisor, a 26-year-old named Todd Ashcombe, who'd been at his job 4 months, radioed for security based on nothing but Finch's complaint. No incident, no confirmed disturbance, just a nervous white passenger's discomfort and an unverified hunch. 2 officers came down that jet bridge, pulled Marcus Bell out of seat 2A by his jacket in front of 140 passengers, demanded ID he had already shown at the gate, and told him, a man who 14 hours earlier had been the CEO calmly restructuring a healthcare merger, a man who 6 hours earlier had thrown a fistful of North Carolina dirt onto his mother's casket, that he needed to come with them and explain himself. Marcus heard those words, and something inside his chest went very, very still. The same stillness he used to feel as a 9-year-old boy right before his stepfather's hand came down. The stillness of a body that has learned to brace instead of react. He didn't yell. He didn't resist. He'd learned a long time ago, the hard way, watching cousins and classmates get thrown against squad cars for far less than a bourbon-soaked accusation, that a black man raising his voice in a moment like this is a black man rewriting the story against himself. So Marcus stood up slowly, kept his hands visible, and said in a voice so calm it unsettled the officer holding his arm, "I've shown my ID twice. My boarding pass is in the seat pocket. I haven't said a word to anyone on this plane." One of the officers, a heavy-set man named Officer Reyes, actually looked, uncertain for a second, glanced at his partner like maybe this wasn't right, but the other one, younger, jittery with the kind of authority that hasn't been tested, yet said, "Sir, we just need you to step off the aircraft. This'll only take a few minutes," which is the exact sentence every person who's ever been wrongly detained has heard right before it took considerably longer than a few minutes. They walked him off that jet bridge in front of 140 passengers, some of whom had their phones out before Marcus had even cleared the door, filming a man in a black funeral suit being escorted like a suspect. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, sitting by the window with her mother, watched the whole thing with her mouth open, and Marcus caught her eyes for 1 second. 1 single second. And something about that innocent, confused little face very nearly broke him, because he thought about his own mother, sitting him down when he was that age, explaining to him gently why some grown men were going to be afraid of him before they ever learned his name, and how unfair it was, and how he had to be smart about it, had to survive it because the world wasn't going to change fast enough to save him from having to learn that lesson too early. Denise, the flight attendant, tried to intervene. He didn't do anything. He didn't even speak, she told the officers. But by then, Todd Ashcombe, the gate supervisor, was already on his radio calling it in as a passenger disturbance, a phrase that would later show up, word for word, in an internal incident report that Marcus's legal team would eventually get their hands on. They held him in a small windowless office near the gate for 23 minutes. 23 minutes, where Marcus Bell sat in a plastic chair, still in his mother's funeral clothes, answering questions about who he was and why he was flying and whether he'd been drinking. He hadn't touched a drop in 9 years, since the year he almost lost everything to a bottle after his first company failed, while 2 officers stood by the door like he might bolt. And in those 23 minutes, something happened that nobody in that room could have predicted. Marcus Bell went quiet in a different way, not defeated, not humiliated, something colder, something calculating, the same stillness that had built a 9-figure empire out of a kid who used to sleep in a car outside a Waffle House. Because here's what those officers didn't know, what Gregory Finch definitely didn't know, and what even Todd Ashcombe, filling out his incident report with a shaky hand, had absolutely no idea about. The airline they worked for, Continental Sky Airways, was 11 days away from closing a $5 billion credit facility and fleet financing package, structured and personally underwritten through Halcyon Capital. Marcus Bell wasn't just a passenger in seat 2A. He was, as of 6 weeks earlier, the single largest financial backer keeping that airline's expansion plans breathing. His firm held options to acquire an 18% equity stake once the deal closed. His signature, not some board committee, his signature was the last one required to release the funds. Nobody at the gate had run a background check that mattered. Nobody had looked past the color of his skin and the fact that he wasn't smiling. If they had, they'd have found a Forbes profile, a Bloomberg interview from 4 months earlier, a keynote speech at an aviation finance summit in Dallas, where Marcus had literally stood on a stage and talked about Continental Sky's growth potential. Instead, all they saw was a black man in first class who made a nervous white passenger uncomfortable. And that, alone, had been enough. When they finally let him go, no charges, no real explanation, just a mumbled, "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir, you're free to go," from Officer Reyes, who wouldn't meet his eyes. Marcus didn't ask to be rebooked on the flight. He didn't ask for a supervisor. He didn't ask for an apology in writing. He walked to a quiet corner of the terminal, sat down on a bench beneath a departures board, and for the first time in over 6 hours, since he'd thrown that fistful of North Carolina dirt into his mother's grave, Marcus Bell put his face in his hands and finally let himself cry. Not because of the officers, not because of Gregory Finch. He cried because it was one indignity too many stacked on top of a day that had already taken everything from him, and because some small, tired part of him whispered, "She's not here to tell me it's going to be all right." He gave himself exactly 4 minutes. He'd learned that from his mother, too. She used to say, "You're allowed to feel it, baby, just don't let it feel you." 4 minutes. Then he wiped his face, straightened his jacket, and pulled out his phone. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call PR. He called a man named Desmond Whitfield, his chief investment officer, who picked up on the second ring already sounding tense, because he'd seen a video starting to circulate on social media. A grainy 30-second clip, shot by a passenger 3 rows back, showing security dragging a man in a dark suit off a plane, already racking up shares under a caption that read, "This could be anyone's father." "Des," Marcus said, his voice flat, controlled, terrifyingly calm. "Pull the Continental Sky financing, all of it, today." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, that's $5 billion. That's 11 days from closing. The fleet orders, the union contracts, half their expansion is contingent on our facility. If we pull now publicly, that airline doesn't survive the quarter." And Marcus Bell, sitting on a bench in a terminal, still wearing the suit he'd buried his mother in 3 hours ago, said the only thing that mattered to him in that moment, "Good." "Good," Marcus said again, quieter this time, like he needed to hear himself say it twice to believe he actually meant it. Desmond didn't argue further. In 11 years working under Marcus Bell, he'd learned there were two versions of his boss's calm: the calm of a man in control, and the calm of a man who had simply run out of patience with the world. This was the second one. Desmond had only heard it twice before the day Marcus fired his own cousin for stealing from the company, and the day Marcus found out a subcontractor had been underpaying black warehouse workers by $2 an hour and terminated the entire contract inside of 6 hours. "I'll draft the withdrawal notice," Desmond said. "Give me an hour." Marcus didn't wait an hour. He sat on that terminal bench and watched the departures board flicker, watched strangers walk past him with roller bags and paper coffee cups, none of them knowing that the quiet man in the wrinkled black suit was about to reshape an entire airline's future before dinner time. He opened his phone and, for the first time, actually watched the video that was spreading online. 31 seconds, shaky, shot from 3 rows back, showing 2 officers gripping his arms and walking him off the aircraft while a flight attendant's voice could be heard in the background saying, "He didn't do anything." The caption underneath, written by a stranger who had no idea who Marcus Bell was, simply said, "This could be anyone's father, anyone's brother, anyone's son," and nobody stopped it. By the time his flight would have landed in Newark, that video had 4 million views. By midnight, it had 11 million, and it had a name attached to it, because a sharp-eyed finance reporter at Bloomberg recognized the man in the suit from that keynote speech in Dallas 4 months earlier. The headline hit at 9:14 that night. Halcyon Capital CEO Marcus Bell, Continental Sky, his largest financial backer, detained by airline security hours after burying his mother. It wasn't Marcus's team that leaked the funeral detail. It was a cousin of his, a woman named Aaliyah, who'd been at the burial that morning and recognized her uncle in the video, posting through tears, "That man buried his mama at 10 a.m. and y'all had him in handcuffs by 6 p.m.? The internet did what the internet does. By morning, Continental Sky Airways stock had dropped 18% in pre-market trading. Their PR department, blindsided and scrambling, put out a statement so tone-deaf, thanking security for their vigilance and offering Marcus a complimentary upgrade on his next flight, that it became its own separate scandal within. 4 hours, screenshotted and mocked across every platform that mattered. Meanwhile, in a glass conference room 40 floors above Manhattan, Desmond Whitfield stood in front of Halcyon's executive committee at 11 p.m. because Marcus had called an emergency session the same night his mother's casket was still fresh in the ground. Some of the older board members, men who'd built careers on caution, pushed back hard. "Marcus, I understand you're upset, and God knows you have every right to be," said Richard Cole, the firm's longest-serving partner, a 68-year-old man who'd mentored Marcus back when he was a 26-year-old analyst nobody believed in. "But this is $5 billion. This is thousands of union jobs, contractors, families who depend on that airline's payroll. Are we punishing the passenger? Or are we punishing the workers who had nothing to do with what happened to you?" It was a fair question, and it landed, because Marcus Bell, for all his composure, was not a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to depend on someone else's paycheck decisions. He remembered his mother's terror the year the hospital cut nursing assistant hours and she didn't know if she'd make rent. He remembered what it did to a family when a company above them made a decision without ever thinking about the people underneath. And now here he was, 12 hours after burying that same mother, holding the exact kind of power that could crush thousands of families who had absolutely nothing to do with Gregory Finch's bourbon or Todd Ashcombe's nervous radio call. Marcus sat with that question for a long moment on the video call, his face lit by his phone screen in a hotel room he'd checked into instead of going home, because home had too much of his mother in it tonight. And then he said something that would later leak to the press and become the most quoted line of the entire scandal. "I'm not pulling the funding to punish an airline. I'm pulling it because I refuse to hand $5 billion to a company that can't guarantee my safety, or my dignity, or the safety of anyone who looks like me, while calling it good business. If Continental Sky wants my money back, they can earn it back, but only after they prove they've actually changed, not apologize their way through a press release. He paused, and his voice, for the first time all night, cracked slightly. My mother scrubbed bedpans for 30 years so a man could sit in seat 2A without being afraid. I'm not letting that be for nothing over one flight. The room went silent. Richard Cole, the old mentor, was the first to nod. The vote to formally withdraw the financing, contingent on a 90-day corrective action window, rather than an immediate, total collapse. A compromise Marcus himself proposed, because even in his fury he thought of the baggage handlers and gate agents who'd done nothing wrong, passed 11-2. By the next morning, Continental Sky's CEO, a man named Preston Hale, who had built his entire public image on being a People's Airline executive, was forced into an emergency press conference with cameras rolling and no good options left. He announced the immediate termination of gate supervisor Todd Ashcombe and the suspension, pending investigation, of the 2 responding security officers. He announced a company-wide bias training overhaul. He even, in a moment that read as pure desperation, offered Marcus Bell a public apology and a seat on the airline's newly created Passenger Dignity Oversight Board, an offer that 3 days earlier, before any of this happened, Marcus would have laughed at as corporate theater. But now, sitting in a hotel room in Newark, still grieving, still furious, still exhausted in a way that went past his bones and into something deeper, Marcus had a decision to make that was bigger than money. Because someone else had reached out to him too, someone he never expected to hear from again, someone connected to the very hospital wing that had failed to catch his mother's cancer in time, and that call was about to change everything he thought this fight was even about. The call came in at 7:02 that morning, while Marcus was still sitting on the edge of a hotel bed he hadn't slept in, still wearing yesterday's undershirt, staring at a ceiling and trying to remember what his mother's laugh sounded like before the chemo made everything about her sound tired. The number wasn't saved in his phone. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "Mr. Bell, my name is Dr. Angela Whitmore. I was one of the oncology attendings who treated your mother, Ruth, in her final weeks." Marcus's chest tightened instantly, the old bracing reflex. "I'm calling you off the record on my own time because I couldn't sleep last night and I felt like you deserved to know something." She told him what the internal review had quietly found but hadn't yet been made public. Ruth Bell's initial complaints of fatigue and abdominal pain, made 8 months before diagnosis, had in fact been documented by a nurse practitioner. But the referral for imaging had been deprioritized, buried under a backlog, because the hospital's scheduling algorithm, adopted 18 months earlier as a cost-efficiency measure, systematically deprioritized referrals from patients on the hospital's charity care and reduced-fee assistance program. Ruth Bell, a woman who'd spent 30 years caring for other people's dying parents without ever once being able to afford her own full insurance, had been quietly, invisibly moved to the back of the line by a piece of software nobody in a boardroom had bothered to audit for exactly this kind of harm. "It's not supposed to work that way," Dr. Whitmore said, her voice breaking slightly. "I raised it 8 months ago in a staff meeting and got told it was outside my lane. I've been sick about it ever since. I thought after everything that happened to you at that airport, you deserved to know the whole truth, not just the part that made headlines." Marcus sat with the phone against his ear for a long time after she hung up, not saying anything, just breathing. Because now he understood something that made his fury at Continental Sky feel almost small by comparison. The plane, the security officers, Gregory Finch's bourbon-soaked discomfort, that was one ugly afternoon. But the algorithm that quietly, bloodlessly decided his mother's pain wasn't worth expediting because she couldn't pay full price, that had taken 8 months of her life, maybe longer. That was the machine working exactly as some cost-cutting executive designed it to work. And nobody had ever been dragged off a plane for that. This is the part of the story that mattered more than the $5 billion, because Marcus Bell had 2 paths in front of him now. He could take Continental Sky's settlement, accept the board seat, let the 90-day corrective window play out quietly, restore the financing once the PR storm passed, and go back to being the disciplined, controlled financier the world expected him to be. Or he could do something with his pain instead of just surviving it, which is the one lesson his mother had actually spent her whole life trying to teach him, underneath all the other lessons about being twice as good and never raising his voice. He chose the second thing. 3 weeks later, Marcus Bell held his own press conference. Not an angry one, not a vindictive one, but a quiet, devastating one. He confirmed the airline incident. He confirmed the financing withdrawal and its restoration, conditioned not just on bias training, but on an independently audited, published passenger treatment protocol with real enforcement teeth, something Continental Sky's board reluctantly agreed to rather than risk losing Halcyon's capital entirely. But then he did something nobody expected. He announced the creation of the Ruth Bell Foundation, funded with $300 million of his own personal wealth, dedicated to auditing hospital scheduling and triage software nationwide for exactly the kind of invisible bias that had cost his mother 8 months she never got back, and to fully subsidizing diagnostic imaging for any patient flagged as deprioritized under a charity care algorithm. No questions asked, no paperwork delays. He stood at that podium, in a gray suit this time, not black, and said, "My mother spent 30 years taking care of people the system had already given up on. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can make sure fewer sons have to bury their mothers, because a spreadsheet decided she wasn't profitable enough to prioritize." He didn't cry at that podium, but 300 people in that room did. Gregory Finch, the passenger whose discomfort started the whole chain of events, was never publicly named. Marcus made a point of that, privately telling his legal team he had no interest in destroying one bitter drunk man's life over an afternoon. The man's own shame, once his identity leaked through a court filing months later, did that work on its own. Todd Ashcombe, the gate supervisor, wrote Marcus a long, genuinely remorseful letter from a job he'd since lost, one that Marcus never responded to directly but did keep, folded, in a drawer in his office, because holding on to both the anger and the grace felt like the only honest way to carry it. Officer Reyes, the one who'd looked uncertain that day, later testified truthfully in the internal review, and Marcus, in a small act nobody outside the family ever knew about, quietly paid for Reyes's daughter's tuition the following semester, after learning the man had been suspended without pay and was struggling. Not because Reyes deserved a reward. Because Marcus's mother used to say the measure of a man isn't how he treats people who can help him, it's how he treats people after they've already hurt him. Continental Sky Airways survived, chastened and changed in ways that actually stuck, because Marcus made sure the 90-day window came with teeth and outside auditors instead of empty promises. Dr. Whitmore left that hospital system within the year and joined the Ruth Bell Foundation as its founding medical director, working every day now to make sure no other family got quietly deprioritized by a piece of code nobody bothered to question. And Marcus Bell, the boy who once slept in a car outside a Waffle House, the son who once heard his mother crying through bathroom walls, the man who was dragged off a plane in his mother's funeral suit, kept a small framed photo on his office desk from then on. Ruth Bell at 40, in her nursing scrubs, laughing at something out of frame, taken on a day nobody remembers being special, which is exactly why he chose it. He still doesn't cry easily. Some wounds don't heal so much as they get folded into who you become. But every year, on the anniversary of her passing, Marcus Bell flies to Gastonia, North Carolina, sits by his mother's grave for exactly as long as it takes the sun to move across one particular oak tree, and says the same 6 words out loud every single time. "You were somebody, Mama. Still are." And that's the story of how one flight, one moment of bias, and one grieving son's quiet fury reshaped an airline, exposed a hidden injustice buried in a hospital's own systems, and turned unbearable grief into something that will keep protecting strangers long after the headlines are forgotten.